All right, so that was Bike from the Pink Floyd's debut album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, which was comes in at number 27 on the best ever albums list of the albums top 100 albums of the 60s. It was released in 1967, and it was the 8th ranked album of that year and 158 of all time. It was recorded between the months of February and May of 1967 and released on August 4th of that year. It was produced by Norman Smith, who we've talked about before. He has produced. He worked with the Beatles, and he worked with the Pretty Things. If you remember, we talked about them way back earlier on. Norman Smith was very prominent around this time, working with a variety of bands. And actually, as we were speaking about the Beatles before, they did record this record at the same time that the Beatles were recording Sgt. Pepper. And at one point, the band was invited to watch the Beatles actually record Lovely Rita. So the title of the album, which incidentally is one of my favorite titles of any album. I think that's just a very Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Sounds like a
evocative title.
It's just it's cool. It comes from. Does anybody know where it comes from?
No, I was wondering.
Mythology, isn't it?
In a sense, yes, but in part. But it's really taken from Kenneth Grahame's 1908 novel, The Wind of the Willows.
Wind of the Willows?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, yeah.
So this was one of Syd Barrett's favorite books, and the book contains a visionary encounter with the god Pan, who plays his panpipe at dawn. And so that was the inspiration for the Piper at the Gates of Dawn.
I remember hearing that book when I was in like first grade, if I remember correctly, which it seemed a little bit adult for first grade, but yeah.
Yeah. So this is considered a psychedelic rock album, as John, you alluded to that a little while ago. Although at the time, the record company EMI tried to downplay the role that psychedelics and the underground scene had on Pink Floyd, putting out a press release stating that, quote, "The Pink Floyd does not know what people mean by psychedelic pop and are not trying to create hallucinatory effects on their audiences," which might be the biggest lie in the history of rock
that's
music.
not true.
That is not true, no. So other outlets specifically called out the band for catering directly to drug users. But interestingly enough, the only member of the band that actually used the drug was Syd Barrett. And that's going to certainly lead to his demise. So I did do a little bit of the history of Pink Floyd back in, I don't know how many episodes it was ago. It was a while back when we did their second album, A Saucerful of Secrets, which Josh affectionately referred to as a saucerful of garbage.
That was episode 10.
Episode 10. Thank you, Josh. Clean that stack real quick. So we're just going to mainly talk about the record here, and I have a couple of other stats to talk about. The album was recorded with both longer improvisations that were reminiscent of the live shows that they were doing at the time, as well as shorter songs mainly written by Syd Barrett. So EMI did the deal that they signed with EMI. It wasn't favorable in many ways in terms of in terms of compensation, but it was favorable to the band in allowing them a lot of freedom to do what they wanted to in the studio. And one of the reasons for that was because the band or the record label really wasn't sure what type of band they actually signed, which I don't know. I just find it interesting that we hear some of these stories about these bands that are getting signed by record labels, and the record labels are surprised by what they've ended up signing. We heard that with Frank Zappa a little bit in The Mothers of Invention. And I don't know if it was kind of like we're trying to just get the next best thing and we'll just, throw a bunch of darts at a wall and see what sticks or what. But it does happen enough, a couple times, certainly in the podcast that we've covered. So the producer, Norman Smith, does recount that Barrett was very difficult to work with in the studio, and he described Barrett as being unresponsive to Smith's suggestions and constructive criticism, whereas Roger Waters and keyboardist Rick Wright were much more receptive to his attempts to jam with them and to try to develop a relationship. Norman Smith said that he just later realized that any attempts to connect with Barrett were just a waste of time. However, Smith did have his influence was felt to a certain degree because he was the one that really drove the band to, convince the band to ditch more of the psychedelic, long longer jams and improvisational songs to include more of the shorter songs on the album, which most of this album is. It's not what you would see later on with Pink Floyd and kind of like long, drawn out, almost proggy songs. This is more straightforward in terms of structure and time, not kind of going all over the place. So he did have that influence on that record there. So leading up to the album's release, we did talk about this a little bit in the first episode with Pink Floyd. Syd Barrett started to deteriorate and would not play during live shows. He would sometimes just stand on the stage motionless, or sometimes he would wander around. He wouldn't sing. And as a result, as I mentioned in the previous podcast, they did have to cancel their U.S. tour and a number of shows. The band tried to get Barrett to see a psychologist, but that didn't really work out. But they did finally perform in the United States on November 4th in 1967 at the Winterland Ballroom, and they followed Big Brother and the Holding Company, so another CTS band that we have covered before.
Way back on episode 1.
Number 1, you got it. And a couple more things.
Yep,
the album...
Pretty Things were 2 for those looking. Yep.
Was that an episode? No, that was episode 2, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's what he said.
Episode 2, that's what I said.
Episode 2, okay. Yep. So the album cover was shot by photographer Vic Singh, who used the prison lens given to him by George Harrison, which gave the effect that you see on the album cover, and it was designed to resemble an LSD trip. Some have suggested that this is a concept album, but the only reason that I could come up with why some people think of that is because people say, well, I can't really figure out one song to play. I need to play this album the whole way through, which I think is a really weak argument for considering something a concept album. So this is really the only record that we get that is pretty much Syd Barrett. Every song on this with there's one Roger Waters song, there's a couple of the instrumental songs are credited to the whole band, but the overwhelming majority of the songs are Syd Barrett songs. And for anybody that, knows later Pink Floyd stuff, this is a very different album than what they would do later on in the 70s that would make them this, internationally, acclaimed band, one of the best-selling bands of all time. So this might be a little bit of a different sound, or a little bit of a shock for some people. And so I'm going to start with, for opinions, I want to start with John, because I'm curious to know, I know how you think about Pink Floyd overall, but this is different than what you're used to, than what Pink Floyd is known for. So what is your take on this record, John?
You know how I was surprised by how much I liked Pink Floyd's second album? It was kind of one of those things where everybody was shocked because I gave it a slight thumbs up, the second album.
I do remember that.
Yeah, not the case with this. Not the case with this one. This was everything I think of in terms of what's hard for me to get into with Pink Floyd. There's just the thing that sometimes is difficult for me with Pink Floyd is there's just isn't anything I can sink my teeth into in a Pink Floyd album. Everything just sort of floats by. Nothing congeals into something that gives me a emotional reaction. I know that it's
what about a
it's
mouse
easy and
without a house named Gerald? You don't think that?
It's easy to stereotype Pink Floyd as a drug band, and I don't want to be that lazy because that's a lazy description. But as much as you're gonna call Pink Floyd a drug band, like, this is the album that would be like argument one for that. It's just nothing really stands out. It just floats together. It's played well enough, but there's no virtuoso playing.
There is no strong songs
and nothing.
on this.
Nothing that interests. Yeah, nothing really interests me. It just kind of floats by. I can't say it's bad, but it's when I used to joke around all the time with Matt and to some degree Josh, but certainly Matt, because I know his feelings on Pink Floyd. And I would say that, at its worst, Pink Floyd is the band that always won the vote at the planetarium by all the stoners to listen to when, we'd have like 6 different options for laser shows, and there'd be all these great bands, right? Like Laser AC/DC, Laser U2, Laser Beatles, and Pink Floyd would win because the stoners would get together and they'd do drugs and they'd watch the planetarium. And like those 25% of people, Pink Floyd and the planetarium was profound, and for the other 75% of people, Pink Floyd was laborious, to say the least. And this album was like the personification of that feel with them. I can't say that everybody wasn't proficient on their instruments, but nothing unlike other albums that we've talked about and we'll talk about, and even this episode we'll talk about, nothing stands out in the musicianship. And I know Pink Floyd well enough later to know that, members of the band can play their instruments, maybe not at a virtuoso level or a standout level, but this just everything muddled together. And it wasn't an unpleasant listen. It just was bleh. Like, that's the best way I can describe it. But I'm interested to hear you guys, if you enjoyed this cell. I don't get the feeling from what Josh just chirped in with that he's going to feel much different than I do, but maybe Matt will have a different opinion. But Josh, what do you think?
Yeah, unfortunately, this album did not change my mind on Pink Floyd so far, and I really didn't like this album. I think I listened to it 3 times because I keep trying to find something to grasp onto or to clarify the reasons why I don't like the band or why it's not working for me. It's just not one of those bands that I'm responding to. I think part of it is the fact that it's so blatantly druggy and psychedelic in the nonsense way, like the Lewis Carroll Alice in Wonderland way. Songs about the gnome and the bike and the silly lyrics about the bikes, and even that song Flaming, which I hate, has Yippee in it. He's like, "Yippee, you can't see me," or whatever he says. And the different weird psychedelic sounds that they put in, that repetition of doi 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 on the power touch H or however you pronounce it. I can't get in with that. And even in comparison to the last album, where I remember saying that there were certain parts where it sounded like it was gonna go in one direction, with a cool guitar part or something, and then it didn't do that. And I didn't even get that here. There was I like the opening of Lucifer Sam, which is the second song, and that's just kind of this cool guitar repetitious guitar part, but nothing else really stood out to me, or there wasn't really anything that I liked, unfortunately. Even silly songs like the one about the doctor, the stethoscope one, take up thy stethoscope and walk. It was kind of catchy, but the lyrics just then pushed me back away from it. So
they sing so clearly too. That's the other thing. You can't ignore the lyrics because you hear all of them, which is normally a positive attribute, but in this case I feel doesn't do any favor. I feel like, Josh, you and I embodied the same body to listen to this album, because it sounds like we had the exact same take on this album, because you could be speaking as me with that.
Yeah, Matt, what do you think about this? And it kind of, I guess, as a broader, discussion of Pink Floyd, what do you like about the band, or what am I missing, I guess?
All right, so
in fairness, Josh, this sounds nothing like later Pink Floyd, so I will
you guys
say
did
that.
say that last time too.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So I'm just curious to know, John, you said you knew this album leading into this, right? This wasn't the first listen for you?
I had listened to it years and years ago.
Okay.
I certainly haven't listened to it nearly as much as, 1970s Pink Floyd, or even, the nostalgia Pink Floyd from the late 80s, when The Wall and stuff was coming in, or back again, right? So I don't know it as well, but I remember listening to it at another stage of my life and not being drawn into it, and trying to give it another listen, since I did somewhat enjoy Saucerful of Secrets, but it just didn't do it, man.
And Josh, you didn't know that you didn't know it at all? Okay.
No, I hadn't heard any of these songs.
Yeah. So I'll preface it by saying that I came to this album years after becoming familiar with their bigger albums, like Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here, and Animals in particular. Yeah. The Wall to an extent, but particularly those other 3 albums. So and I heard so much about this, and I was like, okay, well, this is some people say this is their best album, right? And it's a totally different thing. So when I got the album, and I've had it for years, and I knew it pretty well. I didn't have to listen to it a ton this past week, and I was very taken aback. I was very confused. I didn't know what to make of it. But I have listened to this record a lot over the years, and I do like it. So it's not my favorite Pink Floyd album, but I do appreciate it for what it is, for the time that it came out. I think the Syd Barrett story is very interesting. And I would say this is one of those records for me that the more I've listened to it, the more I've appreciated it. I totally get what you guys are saying and why you don't like it. This is not a album I would recommend, a novice to start with. This is not the Floyd album that you would. This is a different level, but it's cool knowing where they go. It's cool to kind of go back to this and see, where they started and what Syd Barrett was doing. And I do like, what he's doing. It's kind of ridiculous. He's kind of like a child. A lot of these lyrics are kind of like they're either nostalgic or they are, talking about, like the gnome. It's like this medieval kind of thing. Matilda Mother is basically a song about, it's like a thing about nostalgia where he is trying to get his mother to tell him more about the story. He's trying to recapture something up from his youth, but it doesn't really work out. And then a lot of the songs go into these trippy breakdowns and, very psychedelic types of sounds that at the time were very different and groundbreaking. But it definitely sounds dated, right? This sounds like, Josh, you mentioned Lucifer Sam. I like that song a lot, and that's, to me, sounds like something that would be in Austin Powers. That guitar part would be something from, something like that. But even that's like a silly song that's about his cat, right? His cat was Sam, and his cat was basically a pain in the ass, so he called it Lucifer Sam, But there's some really cool stuff on here. Like Interstellar Overdrive is by far the longest track on this record, and it might be the most famous and or important song on the record. It's either that or the opening track, which is I have to say this way, it's Astronomy Domine. And for years, until this week, in my head, when I read that title, I was like, Astronomy Domine. And I'm like, what the heck is Domine? And I'm like, oh, and then I read about it. I'm like, oh, it's Latin. It's Domine. Yeah. So I'm a dumbass, right? Because I don't read. But Interstellar Overdrive, I love that guitar riff. I think that's got a really cool part. It's one of those songs that it starts well and it ends well, and the middle part is a bunch of just very reminiscent of this like freeform jazz experimentation, jam. And it gets a little bit much. It's like the song's a little over 9 minutes. But to me, it's just I pick up on things. Josh, you mentioned you didn't like Flaming. I like the guitar. I think the acoustic guitar part in that is really good, and the way the way that they mix it, I think as the song goes on, they bring that sound a little bit more prominently as it goes on, and I like that a lot. Again, I wouldn't say I love this record, but I do like it, but I've listened to it for many years, and this week when I had the headphones on, I was listening to it more intently. Yeah, I did like it a lot. And Bike makes me laugh. He's basically talking about, I've got a bike, you can ride it if you like, but it's not I'd give it to you, but I can't because I borrowed it. It's just these really simplistic lyrics that just make you laugh. And Barrett was an interesting dude, man. And a lot of people see this as being the genius of Syd Barrett. And I don't think that I'm quite as much there as other people are, but I do like the record. It's very interesting.
Never has Matt not being a lyrics guy been more pronounced than in this segment right here.
Oh, the lyrics are dumb. I could fully admit that they're very dumb, and has nothing. It's very slightly to do with what I like about it, because when it does make me laugh, and it's the ridiculous nature of some of them makes me laugh.
This does kind of veer into that area, though, where sometimes, as much as I can like 70s prog rock, all the talk about warlocks and, fantasy characters and ancient mythology and stuff like that, you can trace a lot of it back to this and those themes. Led Zeppelin is another band that goes into that often with those themes. So, and folk music also loves those things. So, if you like those types of music, you may like this as well.
Yeah.
John, what's what band do you like the most that does those types of lyrics? That what offends you the least, or is it, you know what I mean, or is it like, can
it
you
doesn't
get
offend
past
me
that ever?
It's like this album, for example, doesn't offend me at all. It's just not my cup of tea, as you'd say. We're gonna have so much to talk about with that type of stuff in the 70s, Matt, that I want to save those bullets in my gun until we get there, because it'll give me plenty to talk about when we get there. But sort of that like mythology driven lyricism doesn't always hit with me.
Gotcha.
I think I don't respond to like the dreamlike nature or like playful nature of the lyrics for some reason with this type of psychedelic music.
Yeah.
Just off-putting to me.
Can either of you pick which song was the Roger Waters song? So that's
a good question. Was it Flaming?
No.
Was it chapter 24?
No, that's why I wanted to ask to see if you knew, because it blows my mind that it's this. It's Take Up Thy Stethoscope and Walk. It's a Roger Waters song, which, I mean, Roger Waters.
That doesn't sound anything like what Roger Waters would write later. Yeah.
No, and he was the main songwriter after Barrett left.
Right.
So
that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
It has nothing.
It doesn't even sound like. It doesn't even sound like Saucerful of Secrets, which sounds very different than this album, and that's because Syd Barrett was on it less, right?
He wrote really one song on that. That was mostly Waters and Wright that wrote those songs. It's almost like the Stethoscope song was Roger Waters trying to be Syd Barrett. It's just like, let me see if I can do something that's kind of wonky and whatever. But I would. If I hadn't listened to this album so much, because I did, this was one I focused on for a while, because I'm like, what am I missing? It was when I was in college, and I'm like, I'm supposed to like this, right? So I need to listen to this. So I spent a lot of time with it, and as time went on, I liked it more. But it's not this Floyd album that I would point you to. We're certainly gonna get. It's gonna be a while, because their albums are ranked pretty highly in the 70s. But
and you know what's interesting? They did a song that's kind of goofy on Saucerful of Secrets, that Corporal Clegg song, which actually I really liked. But that, to me, was a much more formed and accessible, likable track than anything here, I would say. Even Syd Barrett's song on that album, Jug Band Blues, I like better than anything on this album.
I will say this, though. If I compare this to like another straight-up psychedelic album that we've covered, the 13th Floor Elevators, I think one of the things I appreciate about this, much more so than that one, to me, this one is much more varied in the sounds. I felt like a lot of the 13th Floor Elevators was just one single track kind of doing the same thing over and over again, and I thought that there was more, even though it's very psychedelic, but there's still variety in here. There's a lot of different things going on, and so I found that being a little bit more interesting of a listen.
But compared to something like the United States of America, I think that is way more varied than this, and interesting on numerous fronts for me. So yes. I see you on the 13th Floor Elevators and agree, because I actually would rank this album higher than that. But compared to some psychedelic that I liked, like the Jefferson Airplane album and United States of America, this isn't even in the same ballpark, in my opinion. Those albums just had more. I didn't feel like I had to be in an altered state to appreciate those albums in the way that I felt like I had to on this one, the 13th Floor Elevators. And I think maybe that's what it is. Like, can you listen to a psychedelic album without doing drugs while listening to it? That, to me, is, I guess, the threshold.
Yeah, that might be. You might hit the nail on the head there for. There's probably some demarcation line between that type of music, and once you go over the line, I'm like, I'm out. Sorry.
Well, yeah, I get it. I wasn't on LSD when I listened to this, nor have I ever been, but I still do like it. So yeah, I think your opinions are quite valid, and I get them. I think this is also this album to me straddles that line of like, you hear this is like highly regarded, it's been critically acclaimed, it's all this, and on the one hand I like it, but on the other hand I'm like, all right, slow down, I'll pump the brakes a little bit on that. Maybe it has to do something with, at the time that it came out, nothing was like this, right? This was just, this groundbreaking type of album, but we see that a lot anyway. So a couple other just quick things, particularly about Interstellar Overdrive. We were talking last week about how things seem
Can I add one thing though, real quick to that?
Yeah.
Was this groundbreaking though? Because this came out at the same time as Sgt. Pepper's, and to me, Sgt. Pepper trod some of the same ground 1,000 times more successfuled.
Well,
if this album was never created and Sgt. Pepper was created, doesn't Sgt. Pepper scratch that itch?
Not as much. I mean, Sgt. Pepper was a couple of months. Came out a couple of months before this, but they were basically recording around the same time. I mean, Sgt. Pepper certainly. Listen. It's not like Sgt. Pepper wouldn't have been influential if Pink Floyd hadn't come out with this a couple of months later. I'm not saying that at all. But this is a little bit of a different type of psychedelic. This was they went harder into that psychedelia than they did in Sgt. Pepper, and I'm sure that there are musicians and people out there that gravitated more towards this than they did with Sgt. Pepper, because maybe they were amazed by Sgt. Pepper and then they saw this and they're like, holy crap, like this is, because Sgt. Pepper was still very much grounded in a lot of pop and a lot of rock that was very familiar, and this was just like, what the heck are they doing? This was a much more, in some ways, that's a good question. I don't know if I want to say it was more experimental, but they went harder at the psychedelia, I would say, in this
Definitely.
record than they did in Sgt. Pepper.
Yes, I would say so.
I would say it's a matter of we can have that another time. I just think it's an accessibility thing. I don't think that Sgt. Pepper was any less experimental than this. It's just that the Beatles wrote better songs. Like, to me, that's what it is. It's like, are you rooted in songs that most people like, or are you sort of and you know what my biggest argument is, Matt? They would go into themes that were like psychedelic in later Pink Floyd and be 1,000 times more accessible because they were just better songs, and that's kind of how I feel about this. Yeah, this
is more weird than it was accessible. Right.
Yes,
and I would agree with that. The Beatles were better songwriters, right? I mean, I'm not going to get that argument from me. So, but this was, I don't know. This was just, it was they laid more into the psychedelia, I would say. But I found it interesting. We were talking about last week about how things doing this podcast, weird things, just coincidental things, just appear to happen. And I had another one of those moments earlier this week. I've been working on a project of watching all the Marvel movies because I have Disney Plus and I get all the Marvel movies, and so I was on Doctor Strange, and I watched that earlier this week, and all of a sudden in one of the early scenes in that movie they start playing the riff from Interstellar Overdrive, and I'm like, that's interesting. I'm covering that album on my podcast this week. And also, that was a song that the band performed once with the accompaniment of one Frank Zappa, who joined them on stage at one point to play to play the song. And there was a quote from where is it? From Nick Mason, the drummer, praised him, saying that Zappa is really one of those rare musicians that can play with us. The little he did was terribly correct. So high praise from Nick Mason. So I was like, bringing it back. Frank Zappa rocking out with Pink Floyd and Interstellar Overdrive. So
one of the few men who can play with him from the '60s. Yes, because we've seen such a shortage of people that can really play their instruments, like such titans as Pink Floyd. So
they had they had high standards, John. They didn't.
I'm sure some luminaries in the last week, like Paul McCartney on bass or Keith Moon on drums or Eric Clapton on guitar, they could never have hung with, the tight unit that was early Pink Floyd.
They're not the same. They're not on the same wavelength as Zappa and Pink Floyd, man.
No, they're different levels. So anyway, so that wraps that up. I'm going to talk a little bit. So this is really the only, Josh, when we do Pink Floyd in the 70s, there's no